Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode in season three of the Top Cyber Pro podcast. And as always, another wonderful, wonderful guest. We have Sal Kimmich. Hopefully, I got the pronunciation right. And Sal has been, all over industry in regards to open source security, in regards to DevSecOps, and there's a lot of different things, AI, privacy and AI. Again, if you Google Sal, you'll find many videos, many articles, and again, I'm so fortunate to be able to get just an hour of your time today. But Sal, can you introduce yourself again and share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And yeah, I am Sal Kimmich. If you've seen my previous work in the last 5 years, you've definitely seen me around cybersecurity. I'm really interested in the interaction of open source and transparency in the new wave of computational security. But before that, I spent my whole career doing open source in different ways, all the way from being an academic to being a federal contractor, and all of the different ways that you can experience quote unquote open source.
Okay. And when you say open source, and again, let's say assuming that some of our audience or people that will watch this episode, what is open source and why is this important to industry?
Yeah, so open source, most loosely, is what you're going to be talking about if you have people sharing code back and forth online. But it does have a legal construct that makes it really, really interesting for certain stakeholders. So most of the commonly accepted open source licenses make a very specific scope of what the person that has produced the code has done and the limits to their liability if reused by a consumer, right? And there's complications to whether or not a consumer should provide code along with that, right? But generally, it's just communicating a one-way relationship of intellectual property, which is really unique to any other sector we've ever seen.
hmm So, what are some of the common pitfalls, if you will, of open source software? You mentioned their origin or the person that actually created it, right? And so, what are some common pitfalls of leveraging open source? Because let's get that out the way, right? Because a lot of people have either the misconceptions or the wrong ideas. But what are some of the more realistic pitfalls?
Yeah, so there's two different layers that I really think of in open source. Now, there's the layer of application development, which is where most people are thinking, right? They're thinking about projects that they're intaking. What is their health? What is their longevity? A lot of those projects have massive global contributor bases to them. We really are trying to get the best of the intelligence of the commons there. And when I take this approach, I look at it as someone that has looked at sort of security and surveillance techniques across cybersecurity. When you look at those systems, I think it's fascinating because things like NASA endpoints, DoD endpoints do still use those technologies. But we really rely on the ability to do vulnerability management at least national or global scale to do that. And it's a space where we've got 0 days and a lot of protection. Um, and I think that it's interesting because I think that's the only spot of cybersecurity that people that didn't get started in the 80s really think about. But I think especially now we should think about open source in regards to our kernels, right? How do we understand and communicate the technology at the layers of actually compiling and getting the bits to flip? Because I think that's a much longer and more interesting story. So you can look at the different kernels, and those are all open source kernels. There's one in particular and a few that are interesting, but one that is the secure kernel. And I just want to remind people that the secure kernel, a completely open instruction list that you can go read still to this day, was open source before the internet existed. So there's an idea of security and transparency in open source that you might not get to see the story of if you just think about application security. But looking at the whole stack now, especially if you're looking at AI, where there's no way to remove the software from the hardware, you have to consider those.
Yeah. And generally speaking, when it comes to software, a lot of folks just feel comfortable because of a big brand or a big company behind it. Like when you think of here the name like Microsoft or you hear a name like Apple, right? And their OSs and so forth. And people kind of get that sense of safety and security because of course they're a big company, they make lots of money. They're gonna obviously their in best interest is to make sure the code and their software is secure. But yet when we hear about like Typhoon and all of these threats and attacks, they're targeting them because obviously the proliferation and the use of them throughout. many organizations, right? And so there's this kind of idea that, well, maybe open source is not as secure, and that I would assume that has to be a big challenge with talking to businesses that are kind of want to go with the big names because of the brand and what they believe that brand represents over, like I said, something that they feel is a gray area for them.
Yeah. Well, so security is getting really, really interesting right now because mostly regulation has required what we would consider stewards of open source to get more involved. So I'll bring a little bit of attention to I think the Linux kernel and the antitrust around it is very interesting. Because there we're really, really trying to produce efforts to make sure that if you bring something that is required to run over the Linux kernel, whichever one it is, if we want to continue building an ecosystem on it, can we make that secure and sustainable, right? Security and sustainability are one in one. You have a big fire, that's not sustainable.
Yes.
So there's two different ways of dealing with this, and the supply chain security is considered stochastic security. You can only really get the best of it by doing right now predictive security, right? Calculating how likely over time a project, or more so the combination of projects underneath it, are likely to have a vulnerability, getting all the way through that supply chain. But that's a very, very different approach from if you were dealing with a new threat surface model, which I think is important to understand, right? So supply chain is great. I'm going to bring together the best resources. I'm going to get an S-bomb that is verified at a specific time, and I'm basically tying my liability to that right now.
Yeah.
Um, that when you have a very different threat model in two ways, I'll put it this way. If you have extremely sensitive data or if you have an extremely sensitive algorithm, then supply chain is still important, but we've just stepped into a new form of security with the proliferation of AI, really, because it's a compute surface, of having to understand and protect compute, actual bit flipping compute. Because even regulators, until last year in December, had never really put down something in writing that made it absolutely necessary if you were dealing with sensitive data. You had to protect it in rest and you had to protect it in transit.
Transit. Yeah.
Now it's required to finally protect it during bit flips, which is such an important move. And I'll give you one story on really why I'm inspired that and why it's so paradigm shifting. One of the most interesting use cases for me, so we're talking about confidential compute and PETs when we're thinking about this wave,
Mm.
really isolated compute security. We recently have been able to, for the first time, produce a defensive machine learning model against human trafficking. Now,
Oh.
this was a domain that was like mostly sitting inside of OSINT techniques, right? So people
Mhm.
that were going and trying to find these and make these sort of aware to any sort of force that could help. But you're not allowed to duplicate or replicate high sensitive databases. So you could try pointing to it, but it's a losing game. The offensive had a fully decentralized set of tools they could use, and nothing that someone that wanted to help could really do. Confidential computing gives you a different guarantee, or using these isolating compute techniques now gives us the chance to protect the data that's collected from a human trafficking site, keep it local to the governing region and all of the policies of that governing region or country, then go in and have only specific trusted players execute specific trusted workloads in
Okay.
that environment, right? So this is coming back to the idea of like, what is your security? What is your trust boundary? And would it be insufficient in this case to consider the operating system part of that trust boundary? And for conditions like that, where there's legal limits to being able to do it, you can put in a new structure in which you're not trusting the host at all. You're not even trusting other workload identities. Because in this case, I have to do like two conditions that really matter.
Hmm.
There's the Jekyll and Hyde, which is if I build a perfect system and there's only one trusted user with the key to all of the power, what happens if they lose their mind one day, right? Design systems against that.
Hmm.
So you can build certain checks and controls into it. But then I think it's also really interesting to make no assumptions about your workload identities at all, to make no allowance for spurious workload identity, because that's where we see all of our vectorized attacks at the moment.
Oh, wow. You mentioned some earlier about the laws and regulations finally, getting up to speed because a lot of folks, until like AI has been the big thing for the last couple of years, but we're seeing a lot of movement now in the legislation and the regulations and the policies finally, seeing the light of day. And historically, though, when it came to technology, usually laws and regulations were usually 2 to 3 years behind. But we're seeing that time, shorten, which it should shorten. I think that getting some guidance and ways to implement is good just to get a start at it. And then, of course, if you need to make adjustments, adjust as you move along. It's kind of like building the plane as it's trying to take off, or while it's in the air, actually, in this case. But from your perspective, what are the good things you've seen in the recent laws and regulations around this, and what are some of the things that you feel that there's still some room for improvement to tighten up or to maybe augment as we move forward?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting place. There's really two lines of legislation that are coming in, and they're not often conflicting. They just don't always line up, and they should, which is privacy expectations, depending on the country, and really sort of like sovereignty or national rights expectations. These two things come together in a really interesting way. And I think one of the things that's important to understand is that if you're looking at this, if you're looking at the regulation or the law, the legal premises of these get really interesting really fast with AI. And it's good to keep in mind that when you're looking at any regulation coming out of the US, no matter what, it is premised on risk to enterprise. If you look at any of the law and regulation that's coming out around privacy for China, for example, it's human rights based. It has a very, very different lens and impact on individuals or groups recording individuals. So I do keep that in mind. But then I think there's also a really fascinating spectrum to pay attention to right now in emerging security technology. So if you look at the US side, really, you want to pay attention to NIST and ICAR because these are the highest standards of being able to have an applied categoric understanding of have we assessed the vulnerability condition? Are we able to remove it or at least be able to know where it is? And that is a really clear-headed way of coming down and finding all of the cases by which, right, what you're trying to do if you're doing the NIST ICAR profile is catch unknown unknowns before they catch you
Yes.
for the cybersecurity. And what's really interesting right now to watch is that all of that is in place and is really in strong effect, right? It's got VEX, it's got all of these vulnerability actual engagements in it. And I'm watching the EU regulation come out, right? CRA. And I
Hmm.
find it's always a very different approach because they have to take an extremely different approach to it. So we've got this extremely technical, extremely rigid, very pleasing to my mind way of looking at cybersecurity. And then we have the actual implementation, and you have to jump into how privacy and sovereignty are different between all of these countries. So I've been paying attention to the language around the implementation, particularly for Germany, because they're an interesting case.
Yep.
They have a much higher focus on their definition of sovereignty kind of relying on the individual and individual education. So there will be much more bias to making someone informed about cybersecurity as a citizen individual. And a lot of their language and regulation is around that, where a lot of other countries are taking a bit different of a more regulated and governance approach, right? So I'm watching those because we've got about half a decade to see what that looks like over time.
Yep. I was just talking to so I mentor a lot of young people into cybersecurity, and I was just recently having a discussion about we were talking about the 9 security principles, and one of the last three was privacy, and one of the first three you learn about in the CIA triad is confidentiality. So they were like, "Well, isn't privacy confidentiality the same thing?" I was like, "No, no, no. Confidentiality is about the organization, the business, whereas privacy is about the individual." And so you mentioned Germany, the EU, which they do phenomenal work because their focus is on the individual, right? The rights of citizens. And then you got the US, which is sector based, right? You got the medical sector, industry sectors, defense. You have all these sectors that have their own regulatory laws given what your information you're handling, the type of information you're handling. And of course, we have PHI, healthcare information. We have PII, but the problem is a lot of times it was the afterthought because it was first about just securing the data, period, and then it was like, oh, it respected individuals. Whereas in the rest of the world, they do take privacy seriously, whether you're in Asia and Europe and so forth. Of course, the number one in the world as far as the most laws on the books is I don't think anyone can catch up to Brazil in any lifetime. But Brazil, most people wouldn't think about it, but they have the most laws when it comes to individual privacy and rights. But as far as what you see in the courts and what's enforceable and that makes the news the most is the EU. I mean, from the GDPR to, I remember several years ago, Germany made it, it was a landmark case where your IP address that's assigned to your home router is personal, private information. And I thought that was just groundbreaking. And the same month, I think they also said that internet was a basic human right. So there were two great landmark cases in Germany. So, as much people would like to talk negatively about Germany, this or that, I say, hey, when it comes to laws and protecting individuals, I got to say they're in the top of the game for that. I know we could talk a lot about privacy, and that is a topic that's near and dear to my heart as well. But I do want to talk about the emerging technology because we hear a lot about AI. But I do want to get your thoughts on because I recommend to a lot of my friends who have young people in their households that are just curious. I say, hey, if your kids want to learn something, go sign up on IBM Qiskit and start learning how to program quantum circuits and start learning about quantum development. What are your thoughts about quantum, and what do you see as a timeline before we might start seeing, one general purpose quantum computers? That's a milestone, but when will we see the need for people to start, whether they're transposing traditional apps into quantum usable apps or just rebuilding apps from the ground up? When do you think these timeframes, in your opinion, in perspective?
Yeah, so I've got limited perspective on it because I was looking at this earlier this year just in terms of its interaction with confidential computing. So we can do quantum enabled confidential computing, which was really my only concern. Can we keep things secure while we speed up compute? Um, but I think it's interesting. So and I'm looking at this again from an antitrust perspective of what is actually getting put into the space as something that's long term and held, and everything is so in an R&D phase. And I think I'll leave it at this thought that I keep having in mind. So there was a study done and it asked the researchers around quantum, like at what point do you think we are at a serious concern of being to fully overhaul? And the answers from the experts were ranging anywhere from 5 to 30 years. And that is independent of what job role they had. So it's not like the engineers felt differently than the project managers. And I think I've just never seen a space where it looks that way. And it's probably because that's diffused information, because most of the time you're going to have 10 companies competing on this. And this is also nation states competing at this scale. And if
Yes.
they know for sure that they're going to have the technology in 2 years, they're absolutely going to be communicating it because it's going to limit competitors' need or want to engage, right? So it's going to stifle competition to be public about being quantum capable. That said, it is coming down the map. It's interesting. We can't ignore network security at the same time.
Hmm.
I think it's really interesting the sincere hardening and like really reckoning
Hmm.
of cryptography at the same time as quantum means that we're walking into, again, one of these really new and interesting phases of a higher bar of transparency around these secure primitives than we've ever seen before because we absolutely need it. It's
Yes,
security necessary at
of
this
course.
stage.
Yeah. So I want to kind of shift over to talk more about you and your career. A favorite question of mine I ask every guest of mine is if we could go back in time to your day one, the day that you made the decision that, hey, this is what I want my career to be in, this is what I want to learn and live and breathe every day. Do you mind sharing your story of your day one?
Yeah, I was thinking about that recently, and I guess it was just like I was trying to remember because a mentee asked me, like, when was the first time you shared code? And I was like, I guess technically like 2012, 2013, I was in school and I was shaping up some Python codes for brain imaging because I was working in a brain imaging lab at the time.
Yeah.
And I think I've had this really unique experience of getting to like sincerely champion open source in different contexts because even as an undergrad, I was really engaged in research and I got a full scholarship, including research funding as
Nice.
an undergrad, right? But that flipped my mind in a way that I don't think people get to experience until they're usually much later in their careers, where I had a massive institution say, by the way, whatever it is that you want to study, you can go do it. You can financially go do it. So I spent my summers at MIT and I learned about real-time brain imaging, which was the coolest thing that you could do
Wow.
in brain imaging at the time, still is. But so I was just working on Python, getting these scripts together, running things like brain hacks, which is once a year, all of the neuro-Debian people get together, share their scripts, try to stop wasting time.
Hmm.
Um, and I ran an online course that took 3 months because I was like, I know all of the experts in this field. Why don't we just hook this up to AWS? I got a bunch of AWS credits. Thank you all for that still. This
Okay.
is 2017. Um, but we got over 700 people to start from like, what is a reproducible pipeline, all the way up to getting it up on SageMaker, all the way to having to redo a bunch of the studies because no one told us we were at a lower tier on AWS. So there were threading issues,
Hmm.
which we can't have for reproducible science. You always learn by trying to compute. So I got done with that, and I was already at a point in my career where I had openly published on, so we used OnePlus to publish our research, which was a methods paper. And then I got recruited into federal contracting, which was a really whiplash different stage of my career from, going to open source. We're quite literally an open source brain imaging tool called AFNI was in the same hallway as me, very, very much around the power of the commons for science. And then I went over to federal contracting, and it was all about consuming open source without upstreaming, but still having to have all of those concerns, right? When we talk about vulnerabilities, like I would run the vulnerability scanning 2 times a week. I would only run the integration test once. It's twice as important to make sure you don't have anything bad in there, right? Um, and that's still really true to this day. Um, but I moved to the UK a few years later, and it was my like I really had no option because they don't let you work in skiffs if you've left the country. So a career shift. And I said, you know what? I'm going to go and swim upstream as much as I possibly can. I've seen so much of the security intake side of this, and I want to watch this journey from the outside. And I have been, and I have not been alone in this at all, right? So there was such a movement in sort of security clearance spaces that it was so important to be communicating, to be public over these things that fundamentally are public, right? Get rid of the cultural concerns because the security is transparency by design.
Yes. 100%.
And I've gotten to see that because I've been, working with and around the Linux Foundation, but also watching like my last like federal contracting employer, Kessel Run. They're a software incubator for the US Air Force.
Hmm.
And now they're contributing projects directly to the Linux Foundation. That's just something I couldn't have thought of 7 years ago. And now it makes perfect sense. And it's a real transparency in working with governments that I'm seeing improve, right? Moving these things over if they have a combined use of, defense and or civil, a lot of these things impact like civil infrastructure,
Hmm.
then keep this absolutely open. Yes, put developer hours on it, absolutely, but we're not forking that anymore,
Hmm.
which
Well,
is
I
very
love
cool.
you sharing the story of your day one, and you brought up an organization that I'm glad you actually brought it up because I recently discovered them, and I said, "Hey, they got a lot of free training." And so far, I think I've racked over 100, 150, 200 hours so far in January. I've taken a lot of their training, and it's excellent training. So the Linux Foundation, which
Mhm.
don't worry about Googling this, folks. I will have the link to their page in the description below. It is phenomenal training Look, folks, when I look at training, one, getting training is first, that's the reward. Immediate reward is learning something new, learning and getting your education. That's first and foremost. But when you get a certificate, okay, you get a little piece of paper you can print. But guess what? You get a Credly badge, a Credly digital badge. I love free training resources that do the trifecta of that. Attack IQ is another company that does that with the MITRE ATT&CK framework and their Purple Team training and so forth. A lot of good training. But Linux Foundation, I've been nothing but thoroughly impressed with the courses and the knowledge they have. So thank you for mentioning them. One of the things I did want to ask is, when you have a career, and Sal, if you guys didn't know, Sal has won awards. She's been recognized throughout industry by various groups and so forth. So it's a phenomenal career. But along your journey, though, has there been either managers, leaders, or people that have influenced you, whether they motivated and inspired you, or just someone that you looked up to that you wouldn't mind shining a light on them?
Yeah, there's I I do think I want to take a little bit of a broad approach on that, just in open source, because I've seen so much cultural change in the past decade and past 5 years, but really getting to see people and companies still sort of standing up and championing and making sure that like there's so much that's gotten so serious about open source, but there's also the fact that occasionally, or 20% of it is just going to be human dendritis. And like watching people still go out and support passion projects is
Mhm.
important to me. And I'm seeing more of that coming in this year. But there's really three things that I'm paying more attention to this year that are motivating me. And they're groups of people that I'm paying attention to that are outside of the norm. So of course I pay attention to the Linux Foundation and I go to any of their like free and recorded calls if I think the topic is interesting, right? So if you think that quantum is interesting to you, there's a sub foundation for that. And I go and I listen to those talks, right? There's these three. So there's in March, there's Open Source Day in Florence, and it comes from Strogener's Hat. They take a really interesting approach on sort of combining the perspectives of like white, black, and gray hat hackers in the modern day. But when I went, there was a talk that really stood out to me, which kind of gets us to understanding like, do you trust the open source platform? That's one question. But number two, can we even continue building in this way over certain sectors? And there was a call from UNICEF that said they had had so many people provide them with applications that they could not use because they were tied to a single platform.
Mm.
Not technically open source, that cuts off a lot of future opportunities of usage, right? So I think being a little bit more aware and working in spaces where they're really aware of that. So they're working particularly with nonprofits and social enterprise. So I'm paying attention to that. There's another group that's sitting out of the Gambian region of Africa called Code Roots. And I'm paying a lot of attention to them because when I put out a call for articles on AI in 2023, I left it open for a month and they submitted several really interesting policy discussions around AI in the African region and understanding very particularly how those geopolitics seem to be moving. And it's a space where I get a lot of opinions, but I am much more interested in the opinions that are really going in and speaking to experts. So Code Roots is doing that. And I think that they're focused, so right now they're really focused on sustainability and doing that in a genuine way. So I'm trying to find the best ways to get more computers out to them, to get more training out to them, and to get cybersecurity awareness like really, really resonating
Mhm.
over the next 2 years in Africa. And then honestly, I mean, the Linux Foundation, but this is just a lot of people think that it's like some foundation up in the sky, which it is absolutely, but also I've used it for my entire career, academics all the way through. It's just like this really massive long hallway of all of the world's experts working on a very specific problem. And it's different from going into like a professor's room where they're going to lecture you on something. You're just going to walk into the room and they're going to be talking about the current technical problem that they're having. And you're going to learn by sitting down and starting to help them, right? Becoming a
Mhm.
contributor. And that's always really, really fun for me because I'm on both sides of that at any given time.
Yeah. Well, I love that you brought it up. And again, the links to the other organizations, if you give them to me, Sal, I'll have them in the description below. I absolutely love that. That was a great answer. So this is a part of the podcast where I like to have a break from the tech talk and kind of have a moment of what I call my moment of levity and just have a little bit of fun. And so if you don't mind, if you'd humor me, I want to hit you with a few rapid fire quick questions with no right or wrong answer. It's just for fun. Okay?
Got it.
All right, let's go. Right off the bat, is a hot dog a sandwich?
No.
Okay. Cake or pie?
Oh, cake.
What kind of cake?
Right now, I'm just thinking I was just in Italy and I got pistachio cake, cream cake, any cake if it's made in Italy.
Wow, okay. Uh, this was going to divide the room, so sorry in advance. Star Wars or Star Trek?
This one's easy. It's obviously Star Trek.
Okay, all right. Another question I have for you is what is your most favorite book of all time that you've read, and what is the last book you've read?
Yeah, I couldn't think of my favorite book of all time, but I brought a couple today, and I'm going to start with the one that I just reread because it's
Okay,
really good. But this one, Unmasking AI, you've probably heard of this, but I don't think a lot of people in security have actually bothered to read it. You should.
okay.
So it talks about computational justice and a couple of the issues that have been coming up all the way to the UN. Really, really useful, really, really good read. Again, was not written by someone who is a cybersecurity engineer, so it's written better.
Okay. Awesome. And again, all these books, if you give me links to them, we're going to
I
have
will
them
send
below.
you
So,
links.
folks, don't worry
to-
about having to Google it. It'll be right there in the description. So, continue.
I'll make it easy. So, Unmasking AI is the best book that you can read about sort of the current zeitgeist in privacy and AI. Then I'm rereading two books that are really good for understanding the culture of open source, in my opinion. So there's Hackers and Painters by Paul Graham, and there's two bits, The Cultural Significance of Software. So if you might have missed the 80s or the 90s or the 2010s, read these books. It'll get you up to
I see
date.
you have a lot of tabs there. So, you have definitely thoroughly read these books.
And then I think when we're thinking about the ICAR and the NIST and understanding that, there's two books that I think are super important right now. So I always get myself reprimed. I read this book over and over. So Basic Category Theory for Computer Scientists and all of the books that are sort of in this repertoire. If you're not doing ACT full time, you have to reread an entire book to then go and reread ICAR, or I can't get it. And then there's this one, which is building evolutionary architectures, but not this one, the newest version. I only have it online, but they did this for policy.
Okay.
So reading these two together and really trying to get yourself understanding security policy in a way that you're not going to have a breach or a lawsuit is helpful.
Awesome.
And then the last two, I promise this is the last
Oh,
two, but these
okay.
are important. I just got
I
home and
see
I
you got the bookmarks and tabs in these too.
yep,
So, I
these
love it.
ones. So this one, cyber deception. I used to rely on this set of books every year or two because they would teach you how to do really advanced honeypots. And now honeypots are complicated because there's AI agents everywhere on both sides,
Yeah.
right? So understanding and getting into that space, and also understanding that like people when they break into your honeypots now are GDPR protected. I don't love that, but that's the truth. That's the truth of what
Yeah.
security and privacy mean, right? So these are all the things you should think about if you're building an AI system or if you're consuming an AI system from someone to understand if they have the right compliance or regulation in place, depending on what kind of architecture they have. So I hope
I
those
love it.
help.
So another topic in AI, and I think it was trying to remember the doctor's name right now, and I'm so sorry to this doctor for not remembering his name right off the top. I think it was Dr. Shapiro from MITRE. I think his name was Shapiro. But I sat down and was talking to us about ethics in AI, and this was last summer actually in Germany in Wiesbaden at an event, and he was speaking about that industry as a whole, or they can't get everybody to the table to agree on what ethics, because depending on the culture, the region, ethics can vary. It becomes a quick gray zone, if you will. And so there's challenges, and what they're trying not to have, but it's already happening, like it does with any technology, is the silos are already going up, left and right when it comes to the ethics in AI. Because again, when you get down to laws, what's legal versus, what's moral. We got always that conflict with when it comes to ethics, right? And the challenges thereof. And one of the recommendations I recommend, because we had a good Q&A at the end, and I just said, just something to consider is that if MITRE would research the philosophical razors like Occam's razor, Newton's flaming laser sword, and so on and so forth, as a potential to provide filters into the ethics discussions, because I'm a big believer in cutting right down as logically as possible, getting right down to a decision point is one of my favorite approaches. But what are your thoughts in regards to our ethics? I know you're well versed in the laws and the privacy laws and so forth, particularly when it comes to AI and data, whether data sovereignty or data to the individual. But what are your thoughts on that topic of ethics in AI?
Yeah, so right, ethics and morality are different things, right? Morality can be considered intrinsic to a person, but ethics is fundamentally, it sits in a substrate between at least two individuals, often two groups of individuals, right? Um, and it's particularly if you're speaking in the Western world, we're going to think about ethics and tribunals, right? So it being raised to a court. That's really what Western empires are culturally known for. And it's handled differently in different systems of power. Um, so the question of ethics means that you have to have two groups of people whose moralities or senses of worldviews are raised to at least a sufficiently equal standard to be able to have a conversation in a court of law. Um, and there's a whole set of cases germane to US law where you have a suspect class. These are people who are not traditionally given a specific demographic or identity factor, who are not likely to be covered under the court of law as currently practiced. Um, and I think we're seeing so many increases of that condition because digital identities are invisible except to those that are attempting to exploit them. So they are not traditionally protected. And I think, I'm paying attention to, there's a couple of interesting, like data back, land back tribal cases, or specifically the Maori people have this really, really strong data sovereignty identity where they
Mhm.
really don't want anything disclosed. And all of these things, whether enforceable or not at this single stage, they're all extraterritorial. So we have to have ethics conversations because they're going to come and they're going to put their tribunal flag down in your republic. Whether or
Mhm.
not you wanted to, you consumed the data. And that's the argument being made. Um, yeah. So it's interesting to watch. And it's also hard to make the argument, what did you disclose, right? If we're dealing with massive data sets that are not being traditionally disclosed as they would be for other things, but that's got computation and financial costs to it. I understand that paywall. Um, but there's a problem of unicity that I'll just cover briefly because it's so important. Um, and this is what the hackers are really going after, right? So if you're dealing with black hats today and they're serious, right? They're working for a nation state actor, most likely. They're still going to be targeting the same things. It's like large databases for like federal and state. They're looking for healthcare records. They're looking for banks. They're looking for these records because they don't need to go through many identifiers to reach a state of unicity for a single or couple of individuals, if that's what they're searching for, right? If they want to capture the complete identity, if they believe that it's within a data set, they can use unicity to calculate whether or not it's worth the time to compute. This all blows out of the water a little bit with quantum computing, but not so much that we're just going to start computing at random, right? So this can still constrain what hackers choose is a loose enough threat model, even giving quantum compute. But what you can find are sparse exemplars, particularly if there's time set data points that are very, very easy to find an individual. So it was incredibly easy to identify a single person using one of NIH's data sets. If that was brought in combination with a breached data set from Netflix that same year,
Mhm.
right? So it's not even the things that we traditionally put the label of confidential on. So I think we need to get past this specific moment of nobody realizing that there's absolutely, I mean, you can put a lock on it, but people can still see what's
Yeah.
inside. by using Spark vector database mathematics.
Hmm.
And I think as soon as we get past that stage, we're going to realize two things, right? Quantum is not the end of the world because it still has the constraints of big compute in that
Hmm.
you don't point it at everything that does not make sense. And then we still have to come back to rational threat modeling, right? We've got to come back to MITRE frameworks.
Hmm.
And we have to really push those cryptographic security primitives, right? Just making sure that we're all working at the same standard. So yeah, I am really interested to see where quantum goes and where quantum takes us, but mostly in the way that it brings together a security ecosystem to have to handle it.
Well, one of the things that I wish that we would see more of from both from a political perspective or a leadership perspective in all countries is, like, the, Homeland Security CISA group with Jen Easterly leading the way for the past 4 years, doing a phenomenal work, is putting out more campaigns of awareness because, big topic is privacy and going back to like the Ed Snowden revelations again, regardless of the politics of what you feel he betrayed his country or not. The bottom line was he revealed that there was some wrongdoing by the U.S. government against individuals and their private information. So the bottom line was that I had thought that we would have had more protests and more people going being angry about it, but it was unusual because majority of people felt like, well, I'm not doing nothing wrong, I don't care. But they don't really truly understand that when it comes to your privacy information, that when you click that OK or that consent button and you do the opt-in consent, you are everything you're doing on your phone, whatever those terms and conditions say, people don't ever read them. And I know South Park did a wonderful episode called, I think it was called The Centipede, where it was, I won't go into the details of the episode, but it was hilarious that people just blindly accept terms and conditions and they don't realize the extent of what their data is being collected. And I know recently with like the legislation and all the talk about TikTok and other apps of, how much data it's mining from us. And data is the new currency, right? Data is why that folks are going after these data breaches to exfil all these records because just simple correlation, building a profile on someone. We could talk about the advertising aspect of it. When you're talking about dog food, and within the next hour, all our social media feeds will be filled up with advertisements for dog food. And there's the conveniences of that, but then people don't truly realize what they're giving up when they allow these apps to have all this, really unleashed access on their lives and so forth. But I think having more privacy awareness. Hopefully, we see more campaigns on nation state levels to global levels where people are getting more aware of their private data and why it's important to protect. So I know we could have a whole podcast just talking about privacy, but I do want to respect your time, and I know we're coming close to the end here. But real quick, what are your thoughts about privacy? Like, what is your own I guess what is your perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, watching the TikTok thing from my perspective has been really interesting because we have a couple of projects from TikTok in the Confidential Computing Consortium right now, right? And so it's really, really interesting to watch political narratives. And I mean, there's always going to be security theater and a lot of the attempt to make people believe that things are far too complicated when in fact they're extremely easy to understand. It might just bring up secondary questions, right? But in this case, right, I'm looking at a different standard of not the political interactions, but actually, is the company itself coming to the antitrust with complete transparency? Can we read every character of every line of code that they're bringing, right? And in this case, you can. So it comes back to the understanding of what is your definition of trust? And my trust is a technological definition. And in the technology that I'm receiving from TikTok that is completely open and transparent to me, I have the expectation of trust that I aim to have. Now, what's built on top of that, or what else is built on top of confidential computing? Paying attention to the actors is absolutely important, but that's nothing new. That's what security has always been about, right? You
Yeah.
can't have a threat model without assuming that someone is attempting to get into your system, right? That's step number one.
Yeah, I love that. So before we wrap up, I want to give an opportunity for every one of my guests. I know that with a demanding career and you speak at events, you have a full plate. But I know that a lot of folks, at your level and our level, we like to give our time to nonprofits, charities, and volunteer work, whether it's your giving of your time and money and energy into a thing, or if it's just a cause that's near and dear to your heart. Is there any of these that you'd like to shine a light on?
Yeah, well, right now, I mean, most of my volunteering is in open source spaces, but there is one thing that I do. I do just a free mentorship program for a couple of people once a year, and I'm reopening those right now. So this is called Gadfly, and it's really for people that are working on a project that's not going to receive corporate funding because it's probably too interesting for that. It's not meant to be a sustained project. So a lot of like open source art, visualizations, some like history or like OSINT work. It really depends. But I do keep that open for three people once a year. I've got one gadfly in place right now. And we ask a couple of questions, then you get a full community of maintainers that come in to ask, like explain to you what their maintainer journey was and how to build a project and how to ask yourself whether or not you want to maintain, right? So this is very much for an open source enthusiast. But
Okay.
if you've got a project that you've been wanting to work on and you can answer one question, just ask yourself who three people, living or dead, would be incredibly proud to see you get this done. And then number
Oh,
two, if you get this done, what is it going to feel like to bring this to the world? And what is your true definition of done? So you take a really, really big dream that you know this person is going to continue feeling like they're not getting it done unless they just go try it once. And then you give them a very, very clear definition of done. You scope it, you give them all the technological support you can, 3 months or 6 months, depending on the project. And then sometimes they go public and sometimes they don't. But we've got a couple of such interesting gadflies coming through this year. In the past, we've done like data visualizations around supply chain. We've done generative AI. We're building a course right now. It's a little bit on pause, but we're building a course that has been doing uh, using machine vision to be able to re-see and reanalyze stuff coming off of like the James Webb telescope. Because some
oh,
of the original producers of a lot of that like astrology, astro imagery, they don't have good enough vision to see them now. So you've got to reorient them in sound or something else to be able to allow the people that created the technology to experience it. So yeah, if you've got a gadfly, jump onto salkimmich.com. I'll give you the little template that tells you how to do a gadfly, and I'll let you know if I'm interested. And if I'm not, you'll answer a bunch of questions that are going to reduce your likelihood of not completing your project in the first 3 months, because we talk all about burnout metrics.
mm,
Um, but my last real request is if you enjoyed any of the conversation and the discussion around sovereignty and privacy, it's obviously top of my mind right now. I am trying to put out a really quick book. I want to get all of my interviews done for it by March. So if you care about that, go again to salchemic.com/geopolitical code. We'll give you a link. I want to hear everyone's opinion, no matter where you're from, what your background is. I'm working on a book that probably has space for at least your thoughts. So do reach out
awesome.
to me.
Well, we'll have all those links for you in the description below. And wow, thank you for providing that the mentorship and guidance. Wow, you're a tremendous human being, Sal. At this point, we're wrapping up, but I want to give you the last word. So you got the next few minutes to share your mind, share your thoughts, and time is yours. Floor is yours.
Well, I've got nothing else to say today. Most of cybersecurity does not seem to be terribly on fire in my region today. But I think just one thing to consider, I always say this and I always think this, and I do my best whenever I get the chance. Go and think, is there an open source maintainer that you've been using the tool of for 5 or 15 years? Have you ever considered going and thanking them for that? Especially if they've been maintaining it the whole time.
I know, right?
So that's the last note. Just think like for your personal self, go and look at your GitHub. What do
Yep.
you just use all the time that someone actively maintains as security threats improve? Um, and is there a way that you can say thank you or like pick up one of their GitHub issues? That might be great today.
Well, you bring up a good point, right? The things that we take for granted, the unsung heroes, if you will. So. But
Yeah.
Sal, thank you so much for giving of your time today and sharing a little bit about your career and your insights into this sector of cyber and obviously in dev, SecOps, etc. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.